Hello, and welcome to the slightly cleverly titled Directing Trade in the Coffee Supply Chain. Hey folks, I'm Chris Kornman. I'm the Lab and Education Manager at the Crown, and I've got a number of years of coffee buying history under my belt. And so I'm really excited to talk to you today a little bit about supply chain management in the coffee industry. The Crown is located at 2523 Broadway in Oakland, California. We're a lab and tasting room, as well as an event space and education center. You can read more about us online. Royal Coffee is the parent company of the Crown, family-owned and operated importer in business since 1978 in the Bay Area. And you are on our website right now. Understanding and managing the supply chain is a more complicated matter than it might appear on its surface. In coffee, it's inexorably linked to changes in the physical state of the raw product, to transactional relationships, and to means of transportation. The number of people involved in growing, processing, importing, and exporting a single container of coffee can number in the thousands. And so today we're going to focus on delineating a few specific paths of coffee transactions and looking at the potential impact made by having direct relationships at various points of contact along the way. We'll focus on essentially 5 major roles getting the coffee from the tree to the roaster, and we'll take a look at a couple of case studies. My colleague Evan whipped up this pretty impressive infographic, and as you can see, we're already in the weeds in terms of the coffee supply chain. And so this breaks down a number of different paths that coffee can take on the way from the farmer to the roaster. And we're going to break down each one of these as best we can today. So starting at the top left, we have the farmer who must then get their coffee processed at some type of wet mill in most cases. After the coffee is processed at the wet mill, it will be processed again at the dry mill, and then moved from an exporter to an importer to the roaster. Roasters can develop relationships at many of the various points along the supply chain, and they don't always look the same. Farmers in most of the world are smallholders. About maybe 70 to 80% of coffee growers are, growing coffee on less than 5 hectares of land. And so in many cases, their access to these kinds of production equipment that would happen at the various milling stations is rather limited. And therefore, the farmer's impact on certain elements of quality and trade will also be limited. So having conversations at different points is going to be really beneficial. So let's break this down a little bit, and we'll return to this infographic a few times throughout the course of this session, so we have a better sense of where we're at and where we're going. For all intents and purposes, the farmer is the start of the coffee's journey to the cup. Of course, the farmer themselves will be dependent on the trees that they're growing, and these seeds can be disseminated by NGOs or by the government themselves, and fertilizers and pesticides, all these kinds of inputs make their way to the farmer in sort of a separate part of the supply chain. But farmers will have an immediate impact on the initial quality potential. Their selection of cultivars, the health of their plants, the ripeness of each harvest. All of these different categories set the base level of quality for what eventually will be altered and preserved along down the line. Rarely are coffee buyers also educated botanists, and so in my opinion, it tends to be in our best interests on this side of the supply chain to defer to a farmer's knowledge for most of these types of topics. Farmers' practices can definitely be improved by encouragement to seek professional advice from local agricultural support organizations or the council of an agronomist. And well-informed buyers may also be able to, share experiences from other origins. I think this is one of the benefits of being a coffee buyer who does a little bit of international travel, is to share these kinds of practices with people who don't have the opportunity to see what it's like to grow coffee in other areas of the world. Ideas like introducing post-fermentation soaking or raised beds for drying practices in Latin America, for example, where these kinds of practices were common in East Africa but less common there. Um, there are definitely opportunities for collaboration between the farmer and agents down the supply chain, whether it's a roaster or an exporter, for example. These relationships can have an impact on initial quality and can definitely help the coffee buyer select, for example, a particular cultivar that they'd like, Bourbon or Gesha, for example. Uh, this also opens the opportunity for a feedback loop, providing sensory data such as whether the coffee was sufficiently ripe when picked or whether a particular parcel of the farm consistently tastes better than others. Um, as I mentioned earlier, farmers' plot sizes may range significantly from just a few trees planted in a backyard garden to hundreds or thousands of hectares on macro farms. But regardless of farm size, once the coffee's harvested, it really needs to be rushed to a wet mill or dried in the sun if it's being dry processed as a natural. Not always is it the case, but often moving the raw cherry to its next stage of processing will involve a transaction that effectively ends the farmer's involvement in the supply chain, particularly if they're a smallholder that's bringing their raw cherry to a processing station or to a cooperative. So moving on down this chart, the next step in the supply chain will be the wet mill. And in many cases, farmers will have access to a wet mill on site at the farm, but as the farm size decreases, the necessity for some sort of independent or cooperative centralized wet mill will play an important role. So let's take a look at this next step in more detail. The wet mill, which is also known as a beneficio or a washing station, sometimes called a pulpery or even a central pulping unit, and in Kenya they're known as factories. This location provides a number of services to raw coffee. Um, all coffee must pass through some sort of machinery to remove its skin and part or all of its fruit, and for fully washed coffees and basically any hybrid processed coffees like pulp naturals and honeys, this will all happen at the wet mill. Time, temperature, and humidity are the main quality concerns at the wet mill. Cherries must be processed soon after picking. Fermentation may take longer in cooler weather. Drying coffee might take longer in humid conditions, etc. And even natural dried, processed coffees, those coffees that are dried whole in the fruit, will need space to dry, and that usually also happens at the wet mill. As a farm size increases, so does the likelihood that the farmer will have the access to means of production post-harvest. Most large farms have a wet mill on site, so there's good control of the supply chain from raw cherry to dried parchment. This makes the farmer-buyer relationship especially fruitful. The two parties can converse about pre- and post-harvest concerns simultaneously. Some smallholders will process their own coffee either with a micro mill, which is pretty common in places like Colombia, or by home processing, which is typically just sun-drying cherries in the whole, but occasionally even just using a hand-crank depulper. This, I would say, is probably the exception rather than the rule for most of specialty coffee, however. Farmers may simply sell their unprocessed cherry outright, either directly to an independent wet mill. Some estates also will buy local smallholder cherries, or to some kind of intermediary, a private broker, a true middleman, sometimes derogatorily referred to as coyotes or crocodiles. And these intermediaries will then resell the coffee to the wet mill or dry mill. Um, there is definitely a service that the middlemen in these scenarios can supply, and that usually relates specifically to transportation. Becoming de facto middleman could be as simple as just being the only guy with a truck in the neighborhood. However, these intermediaries also potentially can scoop up the majority of any profit that a farmer might otherwise make by a direct sale from their farm to the cooperative or to the independent wet mill. And in some cases can actually raise the price of coffee for all the buyers down the line, as they've got kind of a monopoly on the supply. An effective alternative to the intermediary is the cooperative model. A group of smallholders might be able to band together to form a self-governing co-op or an association. And these co-ops might be able to then lease or own and operate milling facilities. Because the smallholder rescinds production control over their harvest at this stage, the direct relationship of a coffee buyer to a smallholder farmer will actually result in minimal qualitative impact post-harvest. And so the buyer really has to seek out direct relationships further down the supply chain with the cooperative or private mill, the owner or operator of those facilities, if they wish to speak about the preservation of quality post-harvest. For the wet miller, working closely together with the buyer during this stage can help mutual understanding of expectations and final flavor profiles, as small changes in the amount of fruit allowed to cling to the parchment, for example, can have a dramatic impact on the cup. Fermentation and the style of processing has some of the most dramatic impact on flavor, and so being able to understand the quality feedback loop as a two-way street at this point is really important. Strong washer-farmer relationships will result in better raw product availability for the wet mill and will also improve transparency back to the very top of the supply chain. The next step in the supply chain would be the dry mill. And this tends to be where we start to get some real separation between the processor and the farmer. We're increasing the distance from, the tree on which the cherry was grown. As is the case with the wet mill, there are some rare instances where an estate might have access to a dry mill on site, but that is really rare in all but the largest of farming scenarios. You see it from time to time in Brazil on large estates there, but really pretty rare elsewhere. And in fact, a lot of times the mills will all be located in a central city. For example, dry milling in Ethiopia basically entirely takes place in Addis, and the same is true for Rwanda, where all the dry mills are essentially located in Kigali. And so it all kind of bottlenecks and becomes the central point of processing and then distribution. So let's take a look at some of the different scenarios and relationships that can occur at the dry mill. Once coffee finishes drying, it must be prepared for export. This includes a number of steps that take place specifically in the dry mill, including hulling, that's removal of the parchment, and if it's a natural processed coffee, also the removal of the dried fruit. Screen size sorting, defect counting, density sorting, and bagging. In many cases, fresh coffee will rest in parchment until it's sold before dry milling. Micromilling farmers rarely operate their own dry mill. Rather, they must sell their dried coffee to the mill. Some large private estates will have a small-scale dry mill on site, but even this is relatively uncommon. Cooperatives and independent millers exist, but in many cases an exporter is actually also the operator of the dry mill. Because there's a transaction typically associated with the movement of coffee from the wet mill to the dry mill, there's an opportunity for an independent intermediary here as well, further muddying an already complex supply chain. Coffee buyers who seek to have relationships with the dry miller may expect to have conversations about physical specs like the bean size or the defect count, or about milling lots together and or keeping small lots separate for individual runs through the dry mill. This can cause complications as the microlots frequently associated with direct trade models are often smaller than the recommended minimum batch size for a mill, and these can slow production. The importance of this phase of the direct trade model really can't be understated, despite traditionally being overlooked by many roasters, and therefore it's often left to the exporter or importer to manage the smaller batch and or relationship coffees through the dry mill. In some cases, the dry mill is owned and operated by a cooperative union or an umbrella group. For example, Royal Coffee works with a company in Kenya called KCCE, and while their independent cooperative members run the wet mills, the union group as a whole owns and operates the dry mill and also proceeds to facilitate the export of all that coffee. So they're technically separate organizations, but they're all housed together under one sort of large group in that way. That's not necessarily common, though. In a lot of cases, the exporter is in fact an independent agent that will source coffee from dry mills or wet mills or farmers, and in some cases all three. So let's take a look at the role of the exporter. Any and all outgoing coffee from a country of origin must be processed by an exporter. The exporter's role may include dry milling and in some cases even the operation of the wet mill, but predominantly they are the origin-based corollary to the importer. Exporters facilitate logistics, meaning that they work to book overland transit, including both trucks and trains, as well as occasional work with the ports to facilitate the overseas logistics. They'll also provide quality analysis and control, in most cases housing their own QC labs and performing all of the necessary cupping to determine the value of a particular coffee and the market for that coffee. They also provide insurance and financing, warehousing, and they will directly trade coffees. In this sense, they may also be seen as intermediaries. However, unlike the independent coffee cherry broker who might be buying from a farmer and then selling to a wet mill, the exporter's role is actually a critical one. Without exporters, the coffee could not be loaded onto containers, much less cross borders. It would sit idle in dry or wet mill warehouses without quality value assignment, and it would be uninsured against accidents or quality loss. And perhaps most importantly, the coffee could not be bought by a roaster, for even if the financial transaction were possible, the exporter is the one that's filling out all the paperwork to put that coffee onto boats and trucks and trains. In rare cases, some private estates might actually perform their own export functions, and this becomes true as well for some cooperatives and associations, like we discussed with KCCE, where the cooperative will own and operate the wet mill, and a larger union of these co-ops will own and operate the dry mill, and in some cases are able to perform their own export functions. But probably the most common would be independent export agencies who will be buying the dried coffee from a wet mill or a dry mill. Then their function would be to resell that to a buyer, usually on the other side of an ocean. Some exporters might have sister companies operating as importers. Regulations on these types of organizations tend to be a little on the restrictive side, and so companies that operate under a single ownership must frequently segregate their export and import services into subsidiaries. You see this a lot with multinational companies, where these large groups operate under a single umbrella, where their local iterations will have individual names and different operating procedures, and be run sort of independently. So the company is in some ways kind of selling and buying coffee from itself. Coffee buyers who enter into relationships with exporters will find many services at their disposal, not the least of which being farmer and washing station discovery and introductions upstream along the supply chain. Exporters typically have really good insight actually into the lay of the land in terms of where and when to source particular coffees, and will be the most well equipped to host cuppings in countries of origin as well. The timing and route of export in tandem with the importer may also be discussed between the buyer and the exporter. And so you can see we've kind of reached the point at which the supply chain bottlenecks. The exporter and importer are, in fact, essentially the way that coffee is traded. And this is true regardless of whether it's a spot coffee that's housed in a warehouse somewhere, or it's a direct trade relationship where the coffee is spoken for from the beginning between the roaster and the farmer. All that coffee is always going to be filtered through both an exporter and an importer, even in the case of direct trade relationships upstream. So let's take a look at the role of the importer. Typically, the last step before reaching a roaster will be the importer. All coffee coming into the United States, and most other places as well, regardless of how direct a relationship is, will pass through an importer. The basic definition of an import service is that the import license allows goods produced in a foreign location to enter the country. Importers of coffee also tend to provide a much wider array of functions, including brokering coffee trade, both buying from producers and exporters and selling to roasters and distributors, warehousing, administrating quality control, and facilitating logistics support both overseas from port to port and overland from warehouse to warehouse. Additionally, the importer often acts a bit like a bank, providing financing, hedging, that would be protection against swings on the coffee market, and insurance options for the coffee for themselves and for their clients. Importers frequently officially take possession of coffee once it passes onto the ship at the port of origin. This is called FOB in Incoterms. But in many cases, they'll actually have direct relationships that extend beyond the exporter. Specialty importers like Royal are in the habit of developing their own partnerships with farmers and mills for access to particular lots. In many cases, these types of relationships also involve a particular roaster who's interested in the farmer relationship and immediate access and might have first right of refusal to the coffee. In that way, the roaster and importer partnership can lend itself into a direct relationship to the other side of the supply chain. Other benefits of good roaster-importer relationships include consolidation, wherein a roaster will pre-select a given amount of coffee from a particular origin, and then the importer will work to fill the rest of the shipping container with similar coffee destined to be sold elsewhere, thereby lowering the overall logistics expense for the roaster. Since the advent of direct trade, importers are often maligned as middlemen, and there is truth to the fact that importers come in between the farmer and the roaster, though they're hardly the only kink along the long and winding supply chain as we've seen, and their services are essential to the movement of the product as well as the financing of that movement. In so many cases, there are unique exceptions to supply chain movement. And so I think that maybe to bring this all together, what we can do is look at two contrasting examples of different ways that the supply chain might look from start to finish. One of my favorite coffee relationships is with a farming family in the north of Tanzania, not too far from Mount Kilimanjaro and close to the border with Kenya. The family's name is Vohora, and they run two coffee plantations called Edelweiss and Finagro estates. Each estate has its own wet mill on site, and so all the coffee that's grown on the farm is then processed and finishes drying there on site at the farm as well. The Vohoras also own and operate a separate export business in the nearby town of Arusha. It's only about 2 or 3 hours drive from the farms in good conditions. So they export coffee from themselves, and they also will help to consolidate coffees from their neighboring farms as well with their export business. And so Royal is able to fully observe traceability all the way back to the farm very easily because we're working directly with the same family through the entire process. This might be considered a best case scenario, the path of least resistance in some ways. Communication along the full supply chain is really easy. The family's involved at every step, and so talking about quality concerns, whether they're related to the variety of coffee being grown, the type of post-harvest handling, whether it's being processed as a honey or a fully washed coffee, for example, and the concerns that might arise at the dry mill or exporter's office are all within the same family. So communication is, like I said, quite easy. It's really, in a lot of ways, a kind of a win-win scenario for transparency and supply chain control. Ethiopia is a much more complicated location to work, and traditionally, at least since the ECX has been in place in 2008, getting good traceability from Ethiopian smallholder farmers is really complicated. Most of these farmers are a part of a cooperative, or in some cases simply banded together and sell their coffee to a local private mill or private large estate, which will process their coffee and then resell it. But let's take a look at the kind of the cooperative model in some ways, because this was maybe the most affected by the ECX and the loss of traceability there. I'm going to quote a blog post by Royal Coffee CEO Max Nicholas Fulmer, who is also one of the primary buyers in Ethiopia for our company. And he says, "The long and the short of the ECX is that it greatly improved price transparency and has led to higher cherry prices for farmers, particularly over the past few seasons, but this was all at the expense of traceability. The ECX made it technically illegal for an exporter to be both involved at the farm or mill level and also involved in the exporting of coffee. Abdullah Bagersh's famous Misty Valley mill, which is now called Orisha, had to be sold. Countless ground-level projects were essentially scrapped as exporter involvement and crucial funding dried up. In truth, the only coffees we've been able to buy from Ethiopia with any semblance of traceability below the high-level regional distinctions of places like Yirgacheffe, Sidama, etc., have come to us through the quasi-governmental cooperative unions or have been the result of cloak and dagger tactics by certain less than entirely above-the-board exporters willing to shepherd their coffee through the ECX warehouse. So one prime example might be Royal Coffee's relationship with Bidatu Jibichu, which is really unique, and I'd like to explore the way that that's evolved over the past few years. One of the most important changes at the ECX that occurred in 2017 for specialty coffee buyers is likely the export recognition for farmers or farmer groups that can produce 20 or more quintals of coffee in Ethiopia. This is equivalent to about 4,400 pounds, so it's actually not that much. It's far less than a full container load. Independent non-ECX members and cooperatives can actually now engage in trade directly. As an example of how this has changed the landscape for smallholder farmers, consider one of Royal Coffee's longstanding single farmer projects with Bidatu Jibichu in Gedeb, near Yirgacheffe. For years, Royal purchased Jibichu's coffee from her local cooperative in a one-of-a-kind arrangement that gave our company access to her single farmer lots. Now, having saved the revenue generated from these sales, she and her family have established an export business and banded together with a small group of farmers to sell directly and independently. It's an example of the evolution of coffee trading in Ethiopia at its most successful, and it hints at the ongoing evolution of the ECX. With direct supply chains to small farmers now a legal possibility, access to traceable microlot coffees is a reality for roasters, and better profit margins are within grasp for farmers who were previously beholden to the commodity exchange market. So I think the takeaway here is that supply chain management is a critical business strategy in any industry, but for specialty coffee in particular, the chain is fairly complex, and it makes understanding and transparency of increased importance, I think. Overdependence or neglect on any single step in the process is detrimental to both cup quality and to the quality of a relationship. Our work at Royal Coffee is multifaceted in this regard. In addition to the day-to-day business of importing, like managing logistics, warehousing, insuring, financing, and trading coffee, we're actually actively engaged in a number of long-term direct relationships throughout various levels of the supply chain across the globe. We're really happy to readily point you towards some of our favorites. But we're also happy to simply, take a back seat and gently guide your special selections from the farm, or wet mill, or dry mill, or exporter, just straight to your roaster. This stream, though it's winding, is also navigable, and we'll be there to keep a hand on the rudder for you. You can, of course, always visit royalcoffee.com and check additional resources there, whether it's crown jewels or information on the crown itself, or our blog for further information and educational materials. And you can always come visit us at 2523 Broadway, or email us at info@royalcoffee.com, or dial the number below to get in touch. Look forward to hearing from you, and thanks for listening.